How you doing, Brian?
Well, I'm game for surprises, and today was one of them. You kind of surprised me with our topic. I thought we were going one direction. You pulled the rug out from under me, and we went a decidedly different direction. And next thing I know, we're talking about millennials and what does all that mean? How do we define it? What's that mean for the workforce? How do you lead with intergenerational teams? So it was fun. It took us a lot of directions that I hadn't originally anticipated when I thought we were going to be talking about a completely different topic.
Hey, that's like to keep you on your toes, you know. I was zigging when you should have been zagging, right? No, and I think we went the range from millennials to, leading, across generations to growth mindset. We went all kinds of directions there, and it's a bit different from a lot of our other podcasts. I would say, but I think our listeners are going to really enjoy it.
I think so too, and it's a sign of the times. How many, honestly, I wrote a blog post called "Everything New is Old Again." Yes, I twisted that around from the common phrasing, and that was, I think, back in 2016. And that was on the topic of millennials at a time where I thought it was already a pretty tired, well beaten topic, and the amount that I continue to see that phrase cropping up still, I guess it's always a little bit surprising to me. But I like the conversation that we were able to dialogue on around it and really getting to some definitions and really bringing some things to the forefront. I think that hopefully defy some of the conventional perception about what it is and what it means.
Well, it's a great conversation. I had even heard the phrase, I don't know, maybe a year or two ago, of second wave millennials. So it's just the topic that keeps on giving.
Love it. All right, onward ho, millennial chit chat. All right. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Lead.exe. I'm Brian Comerford in Denver, Colorado.
And I'm Nick Lozano in Washington, D.C.
And today is an episode all about winging it. We're in freeform mode, and it's just me and Nick, and we're going to take the conversation where it may lead us.
Yeah, we haven't done one of these in a while, and I always feel like when we kind of, just have a conversation, we always kind of have some, great conversation when we come off the air with guests or like before with guests. So I figured, like, hey, why don't we just kind of do one of these and see where it goes? And I kind of want to ask you a question, Brian, and it's a topic that people talk about all the time, and it's millennials, right?
Oh, dear.
Yeah, see your eyes rolled. I saw your eyes roll in the back of your head. And for some reason, there is this stigma with millennials, right? Where people think that millennials are A, lazy, right? B, they always go at home. C, they want to know why they're doing everything. Um, I just want to see what your thoughts are on millennials and when you hear that conversation brought up in conversation.
First impression for me when I hear the term millennials flung out there is there's something else going on. I don't know if it's personal fear, if it's part of what I think is just one of those social tendencies to always want to distinguish between the other, right? And it's part of how we do social ranking. I mean, that probably goes back to days when we lived in caves and sat around fires and you know had a pecking order, based on our tribal associations. But to me, the fixation on millennials as if there is this new differentiating force that suddenly has to be reckoned with. It's something that, on the one hand, I think we can thank marketing firms for because they've successfully uh, raised, they've elevated this demographic to the level of awareness for the general public that hey, here's a new group with a lot of buying power, right?
Hmm.
They're out there, as influencers and making decisions and driving um, behaviors across a lot of dimensions. Um, but yeah, there tends to be this perception, and maybe it goes back to when marketing started targeting millennials, that these are kids in college or kids just out of college, and that perception's been dragging along now for over a decade. When I think if you actually look at the timeline for where the generational slicing, occurs, uh, we kind of missed the mark on, who do we think are college kids here. So to me, it tends to be more of an indicator of there's some inherent fear, right?
Hmm.
And it's a way to distinguish there's this other group out there that's the other. I'll kind of start there because there's a lot of ways we can go with this, but I'm kind of interested to throw the question right back at you and hear your definition.
Oh yeah, that's how you do it, Brian, huh? Well, I think for me, sometimes I'm in that millennial generation. Sometimes I'm not. I guess it just depends on who does the math and where I am. Uh, but all those things that we hear about millennials, and I think when people talk about millennials, they're really talking about recent college graduates, right? And somehow a recent college graduate just got ping termed as a millennial, right? And it's just kind of carrying on, like you said, for the past ten years or so. But some of the things we hear about them, right? It's like they want to know why they're doing something. They want to be behind a cause, right? But doesn't everybody want that, right? Don't they want to be valued at work, be doing something that they want to do, be doing something that they want to do? That hasn't changed over any generation of time. I feel like people have always, wanted to feel like they're doing something of worth, right? Um, and like I said, I think it's just really, people just kind of pigeonholing people to try and put them in generational shift classes, I would think, right? There's this great comic called XKCD, um, and they had this whole thing on millennials, and it's like one guy talking to the other one. He's like, when millennials, and he's like, whoa, wait. He's like, most millennials can't answer you because, they're off taking their children to college now. It's like he's like, so maybe they're not the ones who failed to change. Maybe it's you.
Right. Perfect.
But
Yeah.
when we talk about those things, I think everything if you were to take every saying that people say about millennials and just strip millennial off of it and just talk about people in general, those are things that people want as a whole, is what I've noticed, not just millennials.
Well, I think everything that you said is sound. And, I think there's a couple different delineations with it. One is millennials. They're the ones that are forcing this change that the rest of us want to be, steeped in inertia to resist. And no one ever comes out and says that, right? It's like, nah, the problem is really my stodgy generation is change averse. That's not a phrase that you hear rolling off the tongue, right? folks
Hmm.
folks would rather say, there's this, new wave, that's sort of being foisted upon us because millennials have these preferences, and there's
Hmm.
all this entitlement that comes with it, and they want to work flex hours and yada yada yada, all these things that, I think, to your point, it's sort of, I guess we could blame Apple more than anything as, being a leading corporate force for, sort of setting some of those, prerogatives for workforce, or maybe it's more Google, right?
Hmm.
I want to make sure that I've got my, vegetarian cuisine in the work cafeteria right after my massage. Um, but but those are things, my father's of a generation where, he was really squarely in um, uh, a work style where one person could support an entire family off of a single, worker's salary. And those things really started to change and level off sometime in the 1970s, 1980s. Um, and part of it became, because we really had a mixed gender workforce in this country, especially, where companies realized, well, we don't have to give as many perks, and unions are not as much of a force to be reckoned with any longer, in
Hmm.
terms of helping to create standards for what the working class demands. So, millennials, I think, have just been able to be targeted as this demographic where, um, everyone wants this thing that's sort of focused around what makes you feel like you're getting, the most out of your engagement from a job. That, you know, that, I mean, ultimately, all of us should really be knocking on the doors of our bosses asking for some of these things if we're not getting it from our corporate culture already. And we have seen some of these imperatives really starting to shift the way that a lot of companies like to advertise themselves and really try to infuse some of those values into their culture.
Hmm.
um, but I get positioned squarely in Gen X, and I can say, for my generation, there was a lot of that, initial. We get to wear jeans on Fridays, and things that were sort of like, some early indicators of this same sort of thing. But certainly flex hours, remote work, I mean, a lot of this, I think, just coincided with the rise of technology. Some people work in industries and company types that were not impacted by that until much later, and suddenly the outcry is, oh, it's all associated with this one generation, whereas I think a lot of it's really just it's kind of like that fifth wave, right?
Hmm.
There are all of these things sort of coalescing at the same time that are causing a massive cultural shift.
Yeah, and I think like you said, the internet has made it easier for people collectively to find other people like themselves, right? It's not that Generation X or Baby Boomer generation, or Y or anything like that didn't want have flex days and all this stuff. They just couldn't have their voice heard as easily across some type of spectrum, right? Before, when you were stuck to probably your small city or your small town or a big city, even like New York, and you're stuck in your boroughs, right? You didn't know what the rest of the city was thinking. But so let's take this back to a technology perspective, and hiring and finding talent. And you know us as technology leaders, we're always looking for young talent, right? Where's the young talent? And then we always kind of seem to forget about the older generation who might be 55, 60, who's looking for a job, might be a network systems engineer. um, and sometimes when people are looking at resumes like that, they have a tendency to look negatively on them, where I don't see age as a diminishing factor. I see that as somebody who has a lot of experience that they can bring to the table with a completely different perspective than somebody who is a millennial. Um, what do you have thoughts on that? I mean, because I know on the technology sector, we tend to try to hire young, bringing in young talent, but but what about that older talent? The more experienced talent. I guess we'll say it that way.
What about us old codgers? So, so I would say that two of the key players on my current team, they are all older than me by somewhere between 10 and 15 years. And I know you and I have also talked both together as well as with one of our prior guests on the show, Peter Lynch, about having those mentorship relationships, both up and down the demographic chain, as well as the experience chain. And I think that there is a lot of perspective that comes with having a more seasoned person on your team. Now, that can be a hindrance if you've got someone who has been out of the workforce for 15 years, um, particularly in technology, and now they're just trying to get back in. That perspective may be so stale that it's harmful, because there are just so many things that have changed. But if you've got someone who's maintained some consistency within the technology industry, and they're just looking to have a fresh start, for whatever reason, because of where they're at currently in their career. I think there's a lot of value to bringing in folks who are of an older age demographic.
So, Brian, how do you handle leading a multi-generational team where you might have talent that is, recently out of college or maybe a high school graduate nowadays with some technology certificates and people able to get six-figure jobs with just some certificates, to all the way having a senior executive VP of you know technology or operations or something who might be in their late 60s.
It's interesting, Nick. In my experience, I have worked with a lot of different types of people, and it kind of doesn't matter where you fall in the age spectrum or the generation spectrum. I think the key challenge tends to be the same, which is getting people to listen effectively, and not necessarily listen to me, but listen to each other.
Hmm.
Have conversations where they have an open mind. In technology, we know that there's a lot of different approaches to be able to solve the same type of issue. Some of them are based on preferences, some of them are based on prior experience. Doesn't mean that any one solution is necessarily better than any of the others. There are a variety of ways that you can skin a cat, as they say.
Hmm.
Um, but, I think to some degree, sometimes working with older generation folks is very analogous to working with younger generation folks in that they both have sort of uh, you know comparable closed-mindedness to being able to listen to fresh ideas. I think on the one end of the spectrum, if you're older, you feel like you have an understanding of what's tried and true, and you're often suspicious of the latest and greatest. And sometimes that's with good reason. How many times have we applied the latest update for something that's supposed to create a fix for something else that's been nagging us for a while, only to realize that we've added three brand new problems to the mix because of all the other stuff that wasn't properly tested, apparently, with the latest update. Um, but then on the other side, you've got a younger generation who tends to have a pretty cavalier attitude that, hey, man, I'm trained up in all the latest and greatest. I know all of these methods and approaches that, they're new school, and new school is always better than old school. I find that balance, that I like to call teachable old school, is often a good place to be. Um, I've worked with some folks who are of an older generation who they will ask as many questions as possible and sponge up as much information from folks who are dialed into what are the newest techniques, what's the latest syntax, what are all of these different approaches and new software applications. I mean, all these things that we can do, um, they want to know and they want to be effective, and they're not afraid to interact with folks just because someone on the team is 20 or 30 years younger than them.
Hmm.
uh, so I think to me it always tends to go back to mindset, and that's true of the organization as much as it is for your technology team. It's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I like what you said right there, and I'll take a quote from Jordan Peterson, who can be a pretty polarizing polarizing figure these days. But one of his things is like he says, assume that the person across from you knows something that you don't know, and that goes back to the mindset, right? So assume that the person you're talking to probably knows something you don't know. The younger generation might be more hip and up on the newest language, and the older generation has been through it, right? Deployed things, watched stuff blow up, lived through it. Said, hey, we might want to fail cautiously here, right? Instead of just failing fast to fail fast.
Yeah, yeah, and to that point, Nick, I think sometimes maybe a more dangerous constraint that I've seen is once people are emboldened with a title, and typically that means some kind of supervisory title. It's almost like it closes the door on their willingness to ever be considered wrong.
Hmm.
And so, I've actually had probably more problems with team interactions because somebody, paints themselves into a corner trying to pretend that they know something they don't, rather than just, admitting in full disclosure, oh, really? I didn't realize that's the way that that was designed to work.
Yeah.
Or, you know, I didn't think that we could fix it, in the way that you just described. But, if that's something that we can do, I'm willing to give it a try. So again, it's that openness of mindset to me. And then the flip side of that, I think, is, having an inquisitive approach. And, one of our earlier guests, Tommy Reed, in his
Mhm.
organizational design practice, he talked about, when he's in meetings, he tends to scribble on a piece of paper just as a reminder for himself, Q/R. Wait, what is it? No, sorry, Q/S/R. Right. And I asked him what that meant. And he said it's question to statement ratio. Right. How many times am I leading with a question versus I'm leading with a statement? And so it's, again, to me, that's part of that inquisitive mindset where if you're coming into a meeting and you're saying, well, hey, what about if we did this? Or, have we thought about trying this? Or maybe this isn't a technology problem that we're trying to solve at all. What if we
Mhm.
looked at these other things related to process? Or, what if we just shook up the way that this team was structured? Those are the things that can lead you to some solution engineering that oftentimes, end up being a much better sustainable long-term fit versus being obstinate and coming in and demanding that this is the way that it's going to be and this is the way that the ITIL framework dictates how it should work. Things where all of those approaches can be beneficial in certain circumstances, but if you're just going to use it to shut down any kind of dialogue and stop anyone from asking questions, ultimately that starts to erode the entire culture, right?
Mhm.
And it permeates into everything where it's like, we just don't ask questions around here. It's there's only a couple of folks here who can call the shots, and we just have to do it that way. I know that there's a better way. I've played around with this other thing over here, but no one's listening to me, so we're just going to have to do it this other way. So,
Yeah, I really like that. I think it goes back to being a leader, being humble, right? And knowing that once you've reached that leadership role, you're more separated from the day-to-day task, and from a technology perspective, you're more separated from the new technologies that have come out, and that's why you have the director of operations and of IT and of your lead systems engineer. You have those experts to lean on to help you make those decisions, right? Um, at least for me, I'm more um, respectful of somebody. I guess not respectful, but I guess I said I really appreciate when somebody tells me they don't know the answer to something, right? I mean, how often do we hear that, where leaders sit in the room, he just has to have an answer for it. I
right.
really enjoy when someone's like, "Well, I don't know. What do you think? Because that's what you're here for. I don't know anything about, Microsoft Teams. What do you think about that?" A VP of something. You don't have time to, sit down with the weeds of the details of what's going on with a specific technology, but that's why you have your staff around you. And you got to kind of foster them into that to let them um, help you, right? Make decisions. That's what your team's there for. That's what you have a team for, not to make every decision known to man and micromanage them.
Amen to that. Well, and trust, I guess, is that other factor that as we're talking about, in particular, those intergenerational relationships. Um, if you have the trust that someone comes into your organization and maybe they are just out of school, maybe they did just get their certification, maybe they do have a brand new shiny degree that they're anxious to put on the wall of their first corporate cube or whatever. But they don't have a lot of experience to back up some of the things that they know. Doesn't diminish the fact that they actually might have some valuable knowledge worth mining.
Hmm.
And uh, you know in order to establish trust between existing team members, who they may already be sort of dug in, to your team, they can read each other, right? I know you and I have talked about this in the recent Uppath training with the Tuckman's model, right?
Hmm.
Where you've got the classic forming, storming, norming, performing. Well, those cycles, it's not like it just happens once and you only go through one of those phases one time and then you're done. And once we make it through norming, man, we're on to performing and that's it. It's no, every time you've got a change within your team, that dynamic can be altered.
Hmm.
And so you have to anticipate that there's a little bit of that getting to know you phase again. But part of how you can help mitigate some of the storming is to establish trust early. And part of that can be, hey, let's bring in this new team member. Let's sit down and have a discussion around, some of these things that are on this project. A lot of times, if you've got something in your project backlog that looks like scraps, right? Then that can often be something that where you can quickly find a couple of good candidates for someone who's new to the team and you deliberately pair them up with someone else who's more senior or who has a complementary skill set so that it sort of forces both of them into a mode of working with someone where each of them may be getting pulled outside of their element a little bit, or maybe it's something that a project where neither of them necessarily have the specific expertise for what that is. It's going to force them into a mode where they really have to dialogue together. They really have to collaborate to create a solution. Can it backfire on you? Yeah, absolutely. But the number of times that you end up being pleasantly surprised because you see a couple of people go off and the strengths of one and you suspect the strengths of the other based on your recruiting process, and then all of a sudden you go see the magic starting to work on whatever the issue is, and then the pride that comes back, the relationship gets formed as a basis of that trust that's created because you got to see two people pairing up together and having that sort of synergistic flow working together.
No, I really like that. Kind of brings me back to a saying you and I had. I don't know if we said on a podcast or maybe we were speaking, off air some other time. But it was like, do hard things and do them together, right?
Yeah.
Doing very hard things as a team has a tendency to bring your team closer together. At least it has for me in my career, even in technology and outside of technology. Just doing things that are extremely difficult and hard with other people just kind of has a tendency to bond them together.
And hard doesn't have to be, building a rocket to go to the moon. Hard can just be, organizing something that looks different than anything that you've ever tried before, right?
Exactly.
It's, yeah, I mean, this podcast could even be a perfect example for us, right? It's, well, how hard could it be? Well, we're going to find out once we start trying. There's a lot of steps that, maybe weren't really top of mind when we began.
Exactly. And I feel like, doing the hard things and don't be afraid of failure either's, a good thing, right? Y- Allowing yourself the opportunity to fail kind of gives you the opportunity to let go of certain things, to try not to hold on, to try to not fail, right? So if we think of, like, we'll take our podcast example again, and they're like, okay, well, we don't really want it to fail, so let's see if we can market it to people first ahead of time before we have anything. Let's build a list of people. Let's go out and figure out what the best platform is. Let's figure out the best way to record this. And before we know it, we're just analyzing things without actually doing anything. Instead of just taking that leap and say, hey, you know what? I know step one is to at least have a conversation and record it some way, somehow, right? And now we can go on to step two. Well, we have to edit it somehow, right? And that goes back to our, doing hard things, doing them together, but also don't be afraid of failure. And the best time to start anything is right here and right now, right?
Amen. Yep.
But I guess that's just me just rambling, right?
Well, I think there's some golden nuggets in there despite the interruptions.
Yeah, no, it's fine. And then I just kind of want to bring up a quote. When we were talking earlier, about younger generations and older generations and how people perceive each other, without kind of some type of self awareness. Are you familiar with who Les Brown is? Um,
I know Les Paul.
no, not Les Paul. So Les Brown was, this radio DJ in Miami. He's got a really great story, and he had he had like some disabilities, and basically, he wanted to do stuff, and one of his teachers was very influential on him. And he always comes up with this quote, and he's like, what his teacher said to him. He said, it was, "Don't let someone else's opinion of you." Um, let me get
That's
it.
all right.
I don't want to butcher it here. It's like, don't let someone else's opinion of you become your reality, right?
I think that's a worthwhile quote.
Yeah, so I would recommend you go back and look him up in some of his speeches, and he goes into talk about being a young guy, right? That he was young and hungry, right? So he went to this radio station, and he's like, "Hey, I'd like to be a job as a broadcaster." You know, Director says, "Well, do you have any experience speaking on the radio?" "No, I don't." He's like, "Well, do you have any jobs?" "Well, no, I don't." So he's like, then he came back tomorrow, right? He came back again. He's like, "Hey, I'm here for a job." So he just goes through this whole thing of like with his mindset, you know, um, and how he doesn't let someone else's opinion of them become his reality.
Yeah, and I think that's a great mindset to help forge new opportunities. Um, you know, I think dialed into this idea of, what's in it for the millennials. Well, really, if you think about, tying it all back to where we originally started with this, it's what's in it for all of us, right? I mean, why shouldn't we all share in the same entitlements that we tend to cast towards the millennials? Why, from a customer experience, shouldn't all of our preferences be based around making things more efficient, more portable, you know, um, less data intensive, all of the things that, again, seem to be these driving forces where initially we feel some form of resistance, because that's kind of our own cultural storming going on, right? That's a
Hmm.
kind of a Tuckman's model for, really what's happening with these larger cultural impacts. Um, you know, because really, when you start to dissect a lot of the um, sort of outlines of complaints or criticisms or abrasions that you hear that are sort of framed around that millennial demographic, you really start to pick it apart. And to me, it's like, yeah, but I mean, why would we resist wanting to have that? Why can't we make a path to make all of that possible? Because it sounds like we're all beneficiaries at that point. Let's see. I'd like to work less, make more money, have more benefits. Um, you know, make things easier. You just keep going down the list, and it's like, all right. So, what are we resisting for? Because it's easier to hang on to the devil, you know?
Yeah, I know. It's just, I like I said, anytime someone says something about millennials, and they get ready to say something like, "Well, millennials," like, I was like, "Okay, well, let's just strike millennial off of that, and let's just say the statement without it." Because more than enough, like, whether it's your users, your employee base, your team members, you're never talking about one single generation, are you? I mean, you're always leading teams across multiple generations, or you have a user base that's multi-generational. And I think it was Brian Kane when we had a conversation with him, before, when I was out in Denver, and he was talking about that the research actually shows that older generations are better at using computers than the younger generation is, which surprised me. But to a point, older generations, we had a harder time using computers, right? You used to have to know
Hmm.
how to use a command line to even do anything in a computer.
That's true.
Didn't have a mouse, so if you think about some of it, they've kind of grown with technology. And then I see people like my son who's 4, and he thinks everything's a touchscreen. So he'll touch the TV like, why doesn't this work? you know. But I digress. I forget where I was going with that.
Well,
But I would say anytime somebody says something about millennial, just chop that off of that phrase that you're gonna say and see if it stands true just to people in general.
yeah, yeah. I think that's a wise approach. Let me ask you this: are there any books, Nick? I know you love your book list. So, are there any books that stand out that are ones that you feel like kind of tackle this topic?
I think for me, jeez, I don't know if I have any books per se on millennials. Harvard Business Review kind of does a lot of good stuff about leading multi-generational teams. I would say just look up for things like that. Anytime I see a book that says about millennials, I'm just totally shut off about it. What about you, Brian?
Oh, that's a good question. I think a book like Rework is just sort of a good book that talks a lot about jettisoning some of these conventional perceptions that we have about how we do work, why we do work, what should we really be doing about, how we're managing the business that we're in. It's not really a book that targets specifically around anything generationally either. But I think in terms of being a reflection of a lot of what we've talked about, what is sort of, cast as, oh, that's a millennial kind of thing. I think Rework is a book that, it's a quick and easy read, and it kind of delves into a lot of those areas where, pretty quickly you can have a better understanding of, hey, why do all these things need to be this complex? We can actually strip this down to some of the basics, and still have something that's really effective and something that people love. I mean, what kind of a revolutionary concept is that? So I think that's a good one to kind of throw in the mix.
No, that's a very good one, and I'm gonna bring up Dale Carnegie's again. How to win friends and influence people, right? And I know I've mentioned that before on this podcast, but it's a great thing. Like you go back and you read what was written in 1920, and you're like, oh my God, that applies to today.
I was going to say you're reaching back several generations beyond mine, my friend, to get to
Yeah,
that book.
yeah, I know. But I mean, just to me, it's like, and it just popped to my brain when you said rework, but it's like, it has the same kind of concepts, right? Where it's like, hey, when you're talking to somebody, show a genuine interest. Don't fake being interested, just actually genuinely be interested in them,
Right.
and ask some questions. And it's just, the book is just great. It stood the test of time. I mean, it's still like probably on, is it Inc. that posts the number one entrepreneurial books that entrepreneurs must read or something like that? I can't remember. It's one of those. It's like Inc. or Entrepreneur Magazine or something like that posts something like that, and then that's always on the list.
Yeah. 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 For good reason. All right. Well, this was an exciting topic. I'm glad you popped it on me today. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Lead.exe.
All right, thanks.